First of all, I want to thank you for this recognition of the work we are doing in the fight for the ideas of freedom. And here I'm going to tell a little anecdote about what it has to do with my relationship with liberalism. If you go to see an Argentine soccer match in Argentina, you'll see the stands packed with people, very happy people, very colorful, very picturesque, even with chants, truly a spectacle in itself. But no matter how beautiful the stands are and how they look, and how much it cheers, you put the ball in the center of the field, and if Messi doesn't get in to kick it, the ball doesn't move. Why do I say this? Because the cultural battle, the discussion of ideas, is very important. What one does in the academic field is very important. But without political action, you get nowhere. Because if we return to the soccer metaphor, they do kick, they do hit the goal, they keep scoring goals, and they don't care. So the only real way to stop the advance of socialism, statism, collectivism, and constructivism is to stand up to them and battle them, not only culturally but also politically. In that sense, I can share my experience because without a doubt, all the accumulated academic background is an extremely important guide for decision-making. I would almost say it's fundamental because it determines the direction and basically what guides every measure taken. So, that's why I want to tell you two things: how I became a liberal, in a very concise version, and how I'm doing it. In reality, my basic training is as an economist. In my case, like the vast majority of economists, and this emerges throughout the country, there is no mention of liberal economists during my studies. In fact, I often say that if you ask a graduate economist in Argentina who Ludwig von Mises is, they'll say they think he's the number 9 on the Netherlands national team. In that sense, I received a training typical of what's called a post-Keynesian, which would be a Keynesian with Marxist overtones. Then I shifted toward Ford Model T Keynesianism. Then I shifted toward disequilibrium Keynesians. Then toward neoclassical Keynesians. Then, given my foundation in mathematics and neoclassical economics, I became a pronounced neoclassical. Then I ended up becoming radicalized in that situation and aligned myself with the real business case school, that is, with the real cycles school. And when the subprime crisis of 2007 and 2008 and the global disequilibrium arose in the face of the possibility of a new catastrophe on the planet, I turned to Keynes and Friedman for refuge again. So, faced with that frustration I had with economic analysis, I decided to dedicate myself to issues of economic growth because I said, well, I'm going to deal with long-term things. And who knows in 50 years whether I got it right or not. So I was happy, content with all the growth literature, until I was invited by the World Economic Forum to give a presentation. Not the latest, bombastic one, but one on demography and growth. There I came across the work of Angus Maddison, and I found myself facing a very strong new shock. It was the topic of what in growth theory is called, in empirical evidence, the hockey stick. That is, when you take Angus Maddison's series between the year 0 of the Christian era and the year 2000, you will see that GDP per capita is shaped like a hockey stick. It remains practically constant until the year 1800, and from then on, it rises dramatically. In fact, from the year 0 to 1800, per capita GDP only grew by 40%. And this only occurred after the discovery of America in the 16th century. This implied that the world was only growing at a rate of 0.02% per year, meaning it would take 3,500 years to double per capita GDP. Another thing one sees is that from 1800 to 2000, per capita GDP multiplied ninefold. But in a context where the population almost multiplied eightfold. In other words, in those 200 years, GDP multiplied by approximately 72 times. Why is this important? Because the amount of labor in the economy is increasing sharply, yet output grows more than proportionally. In other words, the postulate of diminishing marginal returns is not fulfilled. And a problem appears that in neoclassical economics is called non-convexity. Non-convexity, which is a problem of a mathematical nature, is actually associated with concentrated market structures. And the interesting thing is that when you study microeconomics and look at concentrated market structures, I'll give you the most violent, let's say, extreme case, which is monopoly. According to neoclassical theory, monopolies are bad. And that raises two questions, because when you look at the number of people living in extreme poverty in 1800, that is, more than 95% of the population lived on less than $1 a day. And when you look at it in 2000, that number had fallen to less than 15%. So, in addition, quality of life levels had multiplied phenomenally. So the question is, how can something that has been so virtuous for humanity in terms of well-being and poverty reduction, something so wonderful, be said to be bad by economic theory, supposedly sound economic theory? That situation disturbed me greatly, and it ultimately led me to something wonderful. which was coming across an article by Murray Newton Rothbard called Monopoly and Competition. I remember that when I received that article, a 140-page article, I went out to lunch at work and, well, I rambled on. After 3 hours, when I finished reading the article, I said, everything I've taught about market structure for the last 25 years is wrong. That's when I converted to the Austrian school. What Rothbard points out in that article is very interesting because the first thing one has to consider is that when considering the structure of neoclassical economics in terms of monopolies, the first mistake he makes is what Hazlitt says about the difference between a good economist and a bad economist. They are single-period, single-good structures. In other words, they ignore general equilibrium effects, what happens in the rest of the market, and they also ignore timelessness. So, that already shows that the analysis was flawed. That the analysis was incorrect, that the analysis had serious problems. Not only that, but it also ignored the possibility of substitution. To put it some way, I can have a monopoly on producing Ferraris. Let's say I'm a Fiat, so I can have a monopoly on producing Ferraris, but that doesn't mean I don't have competition from a McLaren, or a Maserati, or a Lamborghini. So, that already showed that there were some problems. And, on the other hand, it wasn't true that a monopoly had to be bad, because in fact, the original definition of monopoly, which corresponds to the Orc-Coke and from which Adam Smith took it, defined a monopoly as a place where the monarch or the prince, or the feudal lord, or whoever the representative of the state was, determined that in the place where you rule, only one company could sell a certain product. That is, if that was violated, the full force of the law would fall on them. And that could mean anything from sending them to jail to sending them to the afterlife. In that context, what became clear is that a monopoly is bad when it's a state-imposed monopoly. Not when there's a single supplier. When there's only one supplier, in fact, as Mises himself said, get angry at the rest of the entrepreneurs who aren't offering the product. Not at the only one who is. I always exemplify this with a case where, let's suppose I have a situation where I have 10 companies offering cell phones. And now a company appears that produces a new cell phone that's of better quality at a better price. Naturally, the remaining 9 companies will go bankrupt. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's inherent to the dynamics of capitalism. In other words, bankruptcies are part of capitalism, they're part of the process. Someone who is more efficient comes along and goes bankrupt. And in that sense, there's a huge welfare gain. Because now you have a better phone, which is of better quality, plus you paid less money for it. And that money you saved can now be used for other things. Therefore, you also have a welfare gain because you now consume more of other goods. But, on the other hand, it's also questionable whether the monopolist makes money. And what's the problem with him making money if, at bottom, he's a social benefactor? He's making money because he's solving a problem for people. And, in that sense, what can he do with all that money he's making? Well, one of the things he can do is spend it, consume it. And therefore, he creates jobs and better living conditions based on where he's spending it elsewhere. Okay, now you're not consuming it, now you're saving it. Well, if you save it, that's going to finance investment, then it's going to generate new jobs in other parts of the economy and allow the economy to continue growing. So in turn, you're doing everyone good. The other is to reinvest in his own company, but if he reinvests in his own company, he'll increase supply even further. Therefore, he'll have to offer even better quality goods at a better price, surpassing himself. And finally, let's suppose he's a tyrant and wants to ruin people's lives. Then he's not going to do any of that. And he's going to take all that money he earned and sink it into the ground. Well, he reduces the amount of money in the economy, the price level is lower. And he distributes well-being to everyone with lower prices. In short, when a monopoly arises from these characteristics, it would be incorrect to label it a monopoly or to go looking for the problem of non-convexities. But that problem exists in economics, because after the enormous damage caused by the emergence of Keynes's general theory, with all economic analysis dismantled, and with the need to rebuild the system of thinking about economics as a consequence of the destruction caused by Keynesianism, you could choose between the line that came from the Austrian school, but which had been defeated by the Great Depression, not because it was the Austrian school's fault, but because of how those who interpreted what happened interpreted it. And, on the other hand, you had the Walrasian line. So, more work was done along those lines of mathematical economics, where, starting with Wald's work, which was already at the beginning of the 20th century, economists like Mackenzie, Arrow, Debreu, and Jan appeared, who basically took up that way of thinking after the arrival of Brouwer's and Kakutani's fixed-point theorems. The reality is that the discussion of equilibrium was a discussion about the existence of uniqueness and stability. And the problem starts when the normative problem, welfare analysis, gets in the way of the analysis, that is, when Pareto gets in the way. And when you have to choose for optimality, you find yourself in the dilemma of choosing between Adam Smith's pin factory, which is increasing returns, and the idea of the invisible hand. So, in the construction as it is posed in neoclassical theory, that is a dilemma. And to retain the welfare properties, economists cleaned up increasing returns, went to production functions with diminishing marginal returns or constant returns to scale. And in that way they managed to maintain the idea of the invisible hand as an optimality situation, where everyone maximizes their utility, and firms maximize profits, resulting in a situation of welfare maximization. But, among other things, by killing increasing returns, they killed economic growth, and neoclassical theory could not explain economic growth. Consequently, he had to systematically resort to patchwork to explain economic growth. I would almost say that the state of economic analysis in these areas is somewhere between funny and frustrating. Because when Robert Solow tests a model with a neoclassical production function, the model developed in 1956 in parallel with Trevor Swan, and tests it in 1957. The situation is very frustrating because it only manages to explain 15% and everything else is a waste. For Solo, the way everything was arranged with exogenous factors determined by hand. Therefore, everything he had to explain the theory, he explained by hand. That debate was settled in the mid to late 1980s by Mankiw and David Romer and Weil, who basically empirically tested a hypothesis put forward by Robert Lucas Jr., which in turn was inspired by something Uzawa had done in the early 1970s, prompted by George Stigler, who was the head of the economics department at Chicago, when he told Solo that the problem was that he hadn't included human capital. Two lines of analysis are developed there. One, microeconomic, which is Gary Becker's, and I'm deeply proud of it because Gary Becker is on that list. In fact, when I lived in my old house, in the center of the living room I had a 1.5 by 1 meter painting of Gary Becker deriving the intertemporal Slutsky equation. So imagine what it means to me, an active follower of Gary Becker, to have seen his name on that plaque. And poor Gary Becker hung on in my living room until my beloved four-legged son, Conan, was joined by Murray, Milton, Robert, and Lucas. I had to knock down the walls and make some renovations, and there was no more room for the painting. But beyond that, literature was basically corrected in this way. And literature continues to be corrected in a way that, from my point of view, is not the best. Probably the person who best interpreted these types of issues is Paul Romer, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics and best captured the ideas of Adam Smith and Schumpeter to explain economic growth. This idea that each firm, with the idea of creative destruction, creates its own monopoly and is constantly trying to capture increasing returns. They make innovations, and this process that Schumpeter described as creative destruction is generated, and it's what allows us to see strong growth. I think these types of issues are obviously important. I would almost say core, to the point that my chief advisor, Dr. Damien Rydell, and I are rewriting a large part of economic theory to be able to derive Pareto optimality,
optimalidad de Pareto, tanto estática como intertemporal,
both static and intertemporal, with non-convex production functions. In other words, if everything goes well, I'll probably win the Nobel Prize in Economics alongside Damien. But that's part of another story, because it would correct this problem. The conflict between the pin factory and the invisible hand would disappear. And this is interesting.
Además, como vivo en Argentina y hemos padecido el drama de la inflación y el economista más importante de la historia argentina, que se llamó Miguel Sidrowski, que estudió en Chicago, que su tesis fue tutoriada por Hirofumi Usawa y además era muy seguido de cerca por Milton Friedman. Una de las cosas a las que se dedicó Sidrowski fue a meterse en la discusión de la inclusión del dinero dentro de los modelos de crecimiento económico. Por lo tanto, esas dos cuestiones me llevaron a ser especialista en crecimiento económico y en dinero. Es decir, que en el fondo soy especialista en hacer crecer una economía y en terminar con la inflación. Y esto es interesante y además liberal libertario en un país que hasta hace poco dominaban las ideas de la izquierda. hasta que en diciembre el 57%
and also
dijo
liberal
que quería
libertarian,
un
in a
cambio a favor
country
de la
that until
libertad.
recently was dominated by leftist
Y en ese
ideas.
sentido,
Until December,
es
56%
impresionante
said they
porque
wanted a
Argentina,
change in
que a
favor of
fines del siglo
liberty.
XIX
And, in that
estaba
sense, it's
en el grupo
impressive.
de los países
Because
más ricos del
Argentina,
planeta,
which at the end of the 19th century
al
was
momento
among the
en que
richest
nosotros
countries on the
llegamos
planet, at the
al
time we came to
poder,
power,
Argentina estaba
Argentina was
140 en el ranking,
140th in the ranking.
con más del 50% de pobres,
With more
en
than
una situación
50% of the
donde
population living in
siendo que
poverty,
Argentina
with
produce
a
alimentos para
situation where,
400
despite
millones de seres
Argentina
humanos,
producing
con una
food for
presión
400
fiscal en el
million
sector que
people,
produce
with a
alimentos del
70% tax
70%,
burden on the
es decir, que el
food-producing
Estado se
sector,
lleva el
that
alimento de
is,
280 millones de seres humanos. En Argentina hay 5
the
millones de
state
personas
takes
que no
the
le
food
alcanzan para
from
comer.
280 million people in Argentina and 5
Además, con la
million
inflación
people who don't have
acelerándose
enough to eat. Furthermore, with
y,
inflation
digamos, al
accelerating,
momento en que nosotros
by the time we
llegábamos,
arrived in the first week of
en la
December,
primera semana de
prices
diciembre
were
los precios
traveling
venían
at
viajando
1%
al
daily,
1%
which is
diario,
equivalent
que
to
es el equivalente al
3,700% annually.
3.700 anual. En la segunda semana se había
By the
acelerado y
second week,
empezó a
it
viajar
had
al
accelerated and
7.500
began
anual.
traveling at
Cuando nosotros ya
7,500%
estábamos en el
annually.
poder, la inflación mayorista
When we
del
were
mes
already in
fue del
power,
54%,
wholesale
que
inflation
anualizada
for the month was
da
54%, which
17.000%
annualized to
anual.
17,000% annually.
Y en ese contexto nos
In
tocó
that
llegar al poder,
context, it was
lo
our
cual,
turn to come to
digamos, no hay
power.
que llorar ni
There's
quejarse
no
ni
need to
nada,
cry or
porque
complain,
con
or
condiciones normales de
anything,
presión
because
y
under
temperatura
normal
la gente no
conditions
va a
of
elegir un
pressure and
presidente liberal
temperature,
libertario.
people aren't going to
Lo
elect a
interesante es que
libertarian
entonces
liberal president.
resulta
The interesting
muy
thing is
claro
that it
que
becomes very clear that
Argentina tiene
Argentina has
en
two
lo
very
económico
clear
dos
economic
problemas muy claros. Es
problems.
decir, el
That
problema es que
is,
no crece. De hecho, en los
the problem
últimos
of not growing.
10 años
In
el PBI
fact,
per
in the
cápita
last
cayó
10 years,
15%.
per capita GDP fell
Y la inflación
15%,
estaba
and
absolutamente
inflation was
desbordada. Entonces,
absolutely out of
era claro que
control.
necesitaba un
So, it was
especialista en
clear that it
crecimiento
needed a specialist in
y en
growth and
dinero.
money.
Bueno, la gente no se equivocó, el 56% eligió el especialista en
Well,
crecimiento
people weren't
y
wrong.
es mi
56%
caso.
chose the growth and money specialist, which is
Y en
my
ese
case.
sentido, esa conversión
And in that sense, that
que
conversion
yo
I
hice al
made to
liberalismo cuando
liberalism when
leía
I read Rothbard and Mises,
leía
and Hayek,
Mises
Walter Block,
y leía a Hayek, a Walter Block, a
Alberto
Venegas
Benegas
hijo,
Lynch Jr.,
a
Hans Hermann
Hermann
Hoppe,
Hoppe, a
Jesus
Jesús
Huerta de
de
Soto, Miguel Angzo
a Miguel Ancho
Bastos,
Bastos
and many other
y otros
giants of the
tantos
ideas of
gigantes de las
liberty.
ideas de la libertad, se volvió un elemento determinante al momento de hacer
It became a
política también,
determining
porque no
element when it
solo
came to
la
politics as
Escuela
well,
Austríaca de Economía
because not only does the Austrian
tiene
School of Economics have a component linked to
parte
economic
vinculada al análisis
analysis,
económico, sino que además incluye
but it also includes
al
a whole
lanzar todo un
approach to
planteo sobre la
liberty
libertad
and
y
an
un
approach to the
planteo
ethics and morality of
sobre la
liberty.
ética y la moral de la libertad. Por eso para nosotros es muy útil siempre
That's why it's always very useful for
enfrentamos
us
a
when we
un
face a
problema,
problem.
es que siempre partimos de la definición
We
de
always
liberalismo.
start from the definition of
Entonces,
liberalism.
yo
So,
suelo
I
usar la
usually
definición
use
de
Alberto
Venegas Lynch, que
Benegas
dice,
Jr.'s
"El
definition,
liberalismo es el
which
respeto
says,
irrestricto del proyecto de vida del prójimo,
liberalism
basado
is
en
the
el
strict
principio de no
respect for
agresión,
one's
en
neighbor's
defensa del
life
derecho a la
plan
vida,
based on
la
the principle
libertad y
of
a la propiedad,
non-aggression, in defense
cuyas
of the right to
instituciones son
life,
la
liberty,
propiedad
and
privada, los
property,
mercados libres de intervención
whose
estatal,
institutions are
la
private
libre
property,
competencia,
markets
entendida
free
en el
from state
sentido de
intervention,
Adam Smith,
free
o sea, en el
competition
sentido
understood in the sense of Adam
de
Smith or
William
William
Baumol,
Baumol, with the
con la
idea
idea de
of
los mercados
contestable
disputables,
markets.
¿sí? La división del trabajo y la
The
cooperación
division
social,
of labor
y donde
and
solamente
social
se puede ser
cooperation,
exitoso sirviendo
and
al
where
prójimo
one
con
can
bienes
only
de
be
mejor calidad, mejor
successful by
precio.
serving one's neighbor with goods of better
En ese
quality or at a
contexto,
better
es una
price.
guía muy fuerte para el
In that
diseño de la
context,
política.
it's a very strong guide
Si
for policy
ustedes
design.
buscan los
If you look at
discursos en
my
la Cámara de
speeches in the
Diputados,
Chamber of
una de las
Deputies,
cosas que
one
van a
of the
ver es
things
que
you'll see is that I
siempre me
always spoke out
manifesté
against
en
the
contra
fiscal
del déficit
deficit.
fiscal. Y la principal crítica
And the
al
main
déficit
criticism
fiscal
of
es
the
que,
fiscal deficit
sobre
is
todas las
that,
cosas,
above all, it's
es
immoral.
inmoral. Si el déficit fiscal es inmoral.
The fiscal deficit is immoral. Because if you have a fiscal deficit, you have to finance it. And one of the most brutal and immoral ways is to use debt, indebtedness. Why? Because debt is future taxes, which means that today's party, of present generations, you are passing the cost on to future generations, to our children, those who don't vote, to our grandchildren, and even to people who haven't even been born yet. Something truly immoral, an aberration. In fact, Argentina has frequently used that mechanism. Argentina is the biggest serial debtor in modern history, so that's also an aberration because it implies violating the property rights of those who decided to finance the party. In other words, we are so irresponsible that we go to parties, borrow, and then don't even end up paying the money back. It's the worst of all worlds. The other case is that, when it runs out of financing, politics resorts to issuing money. In that sense, since the creation of the central bank, Argentina has removed 13 zeros from its currency, destroyed 5 currency symbols, and had 2 hyperinflations without war. Today, we could remove 3 more zeros from the currency. We were on the brink of hyperinflation, which I can tell you we have defeated, we are defeating. Because while wholesale inflation last month was 3.5%, and that annualized to 50, remember that we're coming from 17,000, and last week, food and beverage inflation was 0%. In other words, something that hadn't been achieved in 30 years. Therefore, we are also now defeating inflation because inflation is a tax, an unlegislated tax. Therefore, it is absolutely immoral. Because it also punishes those with the least the most severely, making it absolutely regressive. And, as if that weren't enough, it also distorts the functioning of the price system and, therefore, penalizes growth. In other words, it is a machine for impoverishment. And we are also aggressively attacking the fiscal deficit and the issuance of money. And finally, another way the Treasury finances itself is by raising taxes, and when you raise taxes, it's an attack on property. In fact, if you take it to the limit, if taxes are 100%, we are directly enslaved. So, there is another issue in terms of freedom. The larger the state, the less free one is. In that sense, note that when we came to power, we had a fiscal deficit of 15 points of GDP, 5 in the Treasury, and 10 in the central bank. Our campaign proposal was a chainsaw, and they said we were crazy, that it couldn't be done, that with luck we could adjust a point of GDP, and that the central bank situation would fix itself. The reality is that we made a fiscal adjustment in the first month of our administration and achieved a zero financial deficit. We ended up making a 7-point GDP adjustment in the Treasury, and now we're starting to restructure items and have achieved a 6-point GDP adjustment. Furthermore, we've reduced the central bank's quasi-fiscal deficit, which was 10 points of GDP, by 9 points. In other words, in 6 months of government, we made the largest fiscal adjustment not only in Argentine history, but we've also made the largest fiscal adjustment in human history. We're returning 15 points of GDP to the private sector. Therefore, Argentina has room to grow due to the dynamics of the rebound after making a strong adjustment and stabilizing. It has the potential to grow because it's an economy that, after 20 years, was severely undercapitalized, and returns are very high, which allows for growth even with the institutions we have. Contributing 15% percentage points of savings will allow for an investment boom and, therefore, economic growth. On top of that, as if all this weren't enough, we launched a structural reform program that has already been approved by the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate, and has now returned to the Chamber of Deputies for its final version, plus a DNU. In total, there are 800 structural reforms. Consider that the largest structural reform implemented in Argentina was in the 1990s, during the Menem administration, which implemented nearly 100. In other words, in less than 6 months, we implemented 8 times more structural reforms than the maximum reforms in Argentina. This will allow us to move up 90 places in the economic freedom ranking and become similar to countries like Germany, France, and Italy. However, our program doesn't end there. We still have 3,200 more structural reforms pending. We are thinking about becoming the freest country in the world, and therefore, we are aiming to become the richest country in the world in the long term and, above all, to accelerate convergence through the use of artificial intelligence. Therefore, hand in hand with the ideas of liberty and technological progress, but above all, with the ideas of freedom, of free markets, of respect for private property, of respect for life, with these moral values, Argentina will emerge from its dark present to become the most brilliant example in human history of becoming rich again. All of this thanks to the ideas of liberty, hand in hand with Rothbard, Mises, Hayek, and all those thinkers who not only fought for the ideas of liberty in academia, but many of them have even done so on the front lines. Thank you very much, and long live liberty, damn it.